This week we're going to explore substance use and abuse. So let's have a little overview on the nature of substance-related disorders. And these are problems related to the use and abuse of psychoactive substances. And these substances tend to provide a wide range of psychological, physiological, and behavioral effects. The difference between substance-related disorders and substance use is related to the problems that are associated with the use. So, for example, many people drink alcohol, have a glass of wine with dinner, or have a beer with a friend, and that it doesn't lend itself to being a problem unless the problem tends to be frequency, amount, duration, and or then becomes problematic for an individual in their life, and then that becomes a related disorder. So let's explore some important terms and distinctions. One of those is the idea of substance use versus substance intoxication. So one might use a substance like alcohol versus when they are intoxicated by alcohol. And so that's a distinction that can be made with the idea that it takes a certain number of drinks to be intoxicated. And a certain intoxication drug level in your body. Substance abuse versus substance dependence. So somebody might be abusing a substance, taking a lot of it regularly, but might or might not be dependent on that substance, and dependence meaning that they require that substance to be able to function. I just lost my power. We'll see what happens with the video. The third is tolerance versus withdrawal. So the idea that we have, as we take more and more drugs, we build tolerance. And as we don't take the drug, we may have withdrawal symptoms. There are five main categories of substances. The depressants, which result in behavioral sedation. So the depressants include alcohol, sedatives, and analgesic drugs. We include the stimulants as a category, which increases alertness and elevates mood. And these include cocaine, nicotine, caffeine, and of course, in our working with children and youth, the stimulants also include Ritalin and Adderall and other stimulants used for the treatment of ADHD. Opiates, which are primarily produce a euphoria, and these include heroin, morphine, and codeine. Hallucinogens, which alter sensory perception, and hallucinogens include marijuana and LSD, and other drugs of abuse include inhalants, anabolic steroids, medication, and a range of fatigue drugs that are certainly on the market. According to the standard psychiatric definition, any drug user who passes 3 of 9 tests below is hooked. Several researchers were asked to apply the test not only to drugs, but also to substances and activities like chocolate, sex, shopping, and their responses show it's possible to become addicted to all sorts of things. So, for example, serious runners could pass 3 of the tests by spending more time running originally than intended, covering increasing distances, and experiencing withdrawal symptoms. And a devoted runner forced to stop because of injury, say, might be anxious and irritable. Of course, that sort of depends. That kind of dependency isn't necessarily destructive. Conversely, a drug that falls on the addictiveness test, LSD for instance, may be harmful just the same. That so many things are potentially addictive suggests that addiction's cause is not confined to substance or activity. Our culture may play a large role too in addiction. So take a look at this here, and you can see that these categories here, these standards, are in terms of taking substances, wanting substances, spending lots of time trying to get those substances, is often intoxicated, suffers withdrawal symptoms when expected to fulfill obligations, is curtails or gives up important social or occupational recreational activities because of the substance or activity. Uses the substance, is persistent, is psychological, causes harms, is needing more and more of the substance to achieve the same effect, so their tolerance is building. Suffers characteristic withdrawal symptoms when activity or the substance is discontinued, takes substance or does an activity to relieve or avoid withdrawal substances. And so if you look across the top here, you can see how nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, cocaine, crack, heroin, ice, and so on and so forth fall within these categories. So you could pause this and take a look at this. I'll continue on. When you're ready, you can continue on as well. In terms of ranking today's commonly used drugs by their addictiveness, experts were asked to consider two questions. How easily is it to get hooked on these substances, and how hard is it to stop using them? And although a person's vulnerability to a drug also depends on individual traits and a number of physiology, psychology, and social and economic pressures, these rankings reflect only the addictive potential inherent drug. And so the numbers are relative rankings based on expert scores for each substance include nicotine being the most difficult or the most addictive drug, the hardest to easily to get hooked and the hardest to get off of. Methamphetamine or ice or glass, crack being the next, crystal meth, Valium, Quaaludes, which are a drug that was very present in the 70s. We go down to alcohol, heroin, crank, cocaine being a little less addictive, hard to get addicted, hard to get off, caffeine. PCB, you can see marijuana being low because of its easily ability to get off of ecstasy, mushrooms, LSD, and mescaline. So take a look at this and move on when you're ready. So let's look at alcohol use disorders, and we will explore the psychological and physiological effects of alcohol. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. You are influencing several neurotransmitters, but mainly the GABA neurotransmitter. Effects of chronic and alcohol use include serious alcohol intoxication. Alcohol is very addictive, and without it, causes significant withdrawal symptoms, and some associated brain conditions for regular chronic use include dementia and Wernicke's disease. And of course, fetal alcohol syndrome is a completely preventable outcome of a mother who drinks alcohol while she is developing a fetus in her womb, and we will explore that in a later version. The DSM, and I have a 4 here, but the 5 criteria for alcohol use will be explored, or any drug use will be explored later. Some facts and statistics about alcohol. In Canada, most adults drink in moderation. About 23% of Canadians were found to exceed low-risk guidelines for alcohol consumption, and about 17% were classified as high-risk drinkers. Men more likely than women to drink are also more likely to drink more heavily, although men and women both do drink. 10% of Americans experience problems with alcohol. Most persons with alcoholism can moderate or cease drinking on occasion. 20% of those with alcohol problems experience what we call spontaneous recovery. And drinking too much alcohol leads to anhedonia, or lack of pleasure, or indifference to pleasurable activities, effective flattening of affect, where people are showing a little expression of emotion but still may feel emotion. So let's look at the sedatives, the hypnotics, and the nature of this drug class is really that the sedatives are a calming drug and the hypnotics are sleep-inducing, so barbiturates or analgesic or anxiety-reducing, and these are the benzodiazepines. The effects of such drugs are similar to large doses of alcohol. Combining such drugs with alcohol are synergistic and will create a more severe effect of the sleep or anxiety reducing effect. These all exert their influence via the GABA neurotransmitter, much like alcohol, and we will look at the DSM-5 criteria for these later on. Stimulants and really are widely consumed in Canada and United States, and these drugs increase alertness, increase energy, and examples include amphetamines, cocaines, nicotines, and caffeines. Stimulant use produce what we call elation, vigor, reduce fatigue, and enhance the release of dopamine or norepinephrine, the two neurotransmitters, while blocking reuptake. So these effects allow for a really euphoric feeling, but then these effects are followed by a crash, which is a feeling of depression or tiredness. The criteria for amphetamine intoxication include psychological symptoms and physiological symptoms. Other amphetamines, of course, that are being abused include prescribed stimulants as well, and of course, in the ecstasy is also a similar effects to speed, but doesn't have that crash. Recreational use of ecstasy was really in sharp increase in the 1980s. In terms of that period of time, that's really my period of time of growing up, where people were taking ecstasies and raves and using them for a real exciting, elated, vigorous feeling, although I certainly never took ecstasy myself ever. A student surveyed in 1999 reported that 7% of them had used it in the past year at the highest rate observed in gradual upward trends since 1991. Both drugs do result in dependence. Cocaine produces short-lived sensations of elation, vigor, and reduced fatigue. The same effect comes from blocking the reuptake of dopamine. Cocaine is very addictive, but addiction develops it slowly. Cocaine use in Canada declined over the last decade, although more recently there is an increase in use of cocaine, and this is certainly a concern. There are psychological symptoms and physiological symptoms of cocaine, and most cocaine users cycle through patterns of tolerance and withdrawal. Nicotine is, of course, one of the most addictive drugs, and it stimulates the central nervous system, specifically the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and they result in sensations of relaxation, wellness, and pleasure. And so if people did feel relaxed and well and pleasured by nicotine, then they wouldn't probably smoke as much as they do. And when you combine that sensation of relaxation and wellness and pleasure with a very highly addictive drug, and purposely highly addictive, then you end up with a psychological and physiological symptoms, and you get withdrawal when you don't use it, and nicotine users tend to dose themselves to maintain a steady state of nicotine. So nicotine, and so the concerning for me is that smokers smoke more when they smoke more. They need to smoke more because they get used to more nicotine, and then so smokers tend to smoke more to get more nicotine, and that's no different than using a different device to take your nicotine, whether you're smoking through a nicotine device that delivers nicotine in a variety of ways. The more you take, the more you will need, and the more you become dependent on it. Caffeine is another drug found in tea, coffee, cola drinks, and coca products, and caffeine blocks the reuptake of neurotransmitter, and its small doses elevate mood and reduce fatigue. Regular use can result in tolerance and dependence, and of course there are some physiological and psychological symptoms of caffeine use, and those can include headaches and mood effect, and shakes and irritability, and even physical symptoms as well. Let's move to the opiates. The opiates are a natural chemical in the opium poppy with a narcotic effect and really a pain relief. These are refer to a class of synergistic substances with a narcotic effect. And these are drugs are referred to as analgesic. These include heroin, opium, codeine, and morphine, and they activate the body's endorphins and endorphins, and low doses induce euphoria, and they create drowsiness, and they slow breathing. And moderate dosages certainly are used for pain and for relief of pain, and in high doses can cause death. Withdrawal symptoms from opiates can be long-lasting and severe. So if individuals have been taking opiates for a period of time and then stop taking them, the need and craving and the physical withdrawal symptoms that one would experience would be very profound, which is why medications such as oxy and other pain relief medication are controlled and are really strictly prescribed. On the other hand, when they're not controlled and strictly prescribed, they become a gateway to very serious opioid addictions. So that's something to consider. The DSM-5 criteria for opioid addiction withdrawal include physical symptoms and psychological symptoms, and those mortality rates are high for opioid addicts. The hallucinogens are substances that change the way the user perceives the world and may produce delusions, paranoia, hallucinations, or altered sensory perception. An example, of course, is marijuana and LSD. Yes, marijuana, which is a legal substance for us in Ontario or in Canada, and many states across the United States of America, is a hallucinogen. The active chemical is THC and may produce several symptoms of mood swings, paranoia, and hallucinations, and impairment in motivation is not uncommon. So people who smoke too much marijuana and may have something called amotivational syndrome. Major signs of withdrawal and dependence do not typically occur in use of marijuana. And I guess research and studies have certainly proved that the physical dependence of marijuana doesn't exist. It's more psychological dependence, although dependence certainly can cause harm in a lot of ways. And more recently, for children and youth, are studies in the last 10, 15 years that really explain how marijuana use in youth can trigger an underlying schizophrenia and mental health issue, and that the kind of marijuana and the strength and the THC in the marijuana today is far more profoundly impacting the development of the brain of youth versus what was previous. Of course, a test question or a question we ask is, what's the difference between typical and atypical use of substances? And one must consider that many of the substances described here, that marijuana being one of them, is something that youth may engage in. When it becomes a problem is when these youth tend to use it frequently, regularly, having an impact on their life in a negative way that is pervasively impacting their ability to function at home, school, with peers, and of course, a high frequent use of any drug, including marijuana, can cause a significant impact on the developing brain. Other hallucinogens include LSD, which is the most common form of hallucinogenic drugs. Of course, LSD was very popular in the 60s, banned and made illegal by the US government because of a concern of how youth using LSD might revolt against the American government. And of course, tolerance tends to be rapid and withdrawal symptoms are uncommon in the use of LSD. So psychotic, delusional, or hallucinatory symptoms can be problematic, and psychological and physical symptoms are similar to marijuana and hallucinogen intoxications. Other concerns are certainly a triggering of underlying mental health issues. LSD itself is having a resurgence these days in terms of its use for the treatment of mental health issues in low dosages and microdosing. And if you watch Netflix and other TV specials, you will learn that, for example, people are taking, and when I say Netflix, you could watch Gwyneth Paltrow in her Goop project, and she will explain to you how LSD is used to treat people's mental health and mental well-being. Other drugs of abuse include the inhalants, substances found in volatile solvents that are breathed into the lungs directly. This includes spray paint, hairspray, paint thinner, gasoline, and nitrous oxide. Breathed into the lungs, they rapidly are absorbed with effects similar to that of an alcohol intoxication. Giving an individual feeling of sort of euphoria, relaxation, and then, of course, the tolerance and prolonged symptoms of withdrawal are common and very problematic in terms of the individual's health. Other drugs used are the anabolic steroids. These are steroids are delivered or synthesized from testosterone. They're used medically to increase body mass, and users may engage in cycling or stacking of these steroids. And steroids do not produce a high, but they do have long-term mood disturbances and physical problems. So steroids is another form of youth abuse that needs to be addressed when working with people who are certainly looking like they're building muscle mass fast. Of course, the designer drugs produced by pharmaceutical companies for disease, ecstasy, MDMA, Nexus, ketamine, Special K are examples. And these drugs heighten auditory and visual perceptions, sensation, touch, and became popular in nightclubs, raves, and large social gatherings. And these designer drugs can produce tolerance and dependence as well. So what are the causes of substance-related disorders? And they can include family and genetic influences. And we can see this from twin studies and adoption studies that substance abuse has a genetic component. Much of focus has been on alcoholism, but the genetic differences in alcohol metabolism, and there are multiple genes involved in substance abuse.
Some other causes related to the substance-related disorders are neurobiological influences. These result in these are the results of neurobiological research. And so what we're talking about here is how drug affect the pleasure and reward centers in the brain. In terms of the pleasure center, the dopamine, the midbrain, and the frontal cortex are being impacted by substances. GABA turns off reward pleasure systems. Neurotransmitters are responsible for anxiety and negative affect and may be inhibited with a drug effect. The role of positive negative reinforcement on the brain is significant to the self-medication and the tension reduction hypothesis. So most see substance abuse as a means to cope with a negative effect. So people who are taking medication or medicating because they're reducing the negative effect or feelings of other things. So somebody may be stressed, somebody might be having trauma experiences of the past, bad feelings, and they're using substances as a means to cope. The opponent process theory explains why the crash after drug use fails to keep people from using the drug in terms of wanting more, and the role of expectancy effects. Expectancy influences drug use and relapse. So my own expectancies influence drug use and relapse as we think about how drug influences who you are. One's own thinking does that. Exposure to drugs is a prerequisite for use of drugs. So, for example, individuals who are exposed to drugs in the media, and all of us are exposed to drugs in a variety of medium, through movies, television, Instagram, social media platforms, through family. So individuals who are in families where drug use is happening are more inclined to engage in drug use. Through peers, of course, when you are hanging out with friends and individuals who take drugs, you're more inclined to take drugs yourself. And of course, parents and family appear to be the most critical component. Societal's views on drug abuse in terms of how society views it as a moral weakness, that drug abuse is a failure of self-control, and some views are that it is a sign of obviously a disease, that drug abuse is caused by some underlying process. So a variety variety of views on how people perceive drug use. The role of cultural factors in terms of the influence on the manifestation of substance use is quite significant. Well, let's look at that integrative model of substance-related disorders, no different than the way we look at all the other disorders. Exposure or access to a drug is necessary, but not sufficient enough to explain how and why somebody might become addicted to drug. Just because somebody has an alcohol cabinet doesn't mean that somebody goes and drinks and becomes addicted to the alcohol. Drug use depends on social or cultural expectations. Depending on where you are and what's happening culturally, can impact on an individual's normative alcohol or drug use. Drugs are used because of their pleasurable effects. If they didn't make people feel good for some period of time, people would be less inclined to take those drugs, and then drugs are abused for reasons that are more complex in terms of stress and psychological, genetic, social, and learning factors. And so when you complete those together, you have a more integrative model of cultural, social, the fact that it feels good and it's pleasurable. So there's a biological nature of how drugs are impacting the brain. The use and abuse happens because of many psychological, thinking, genetic, or social components, and this is in combination an integrative model for substance abuse and a use. And of course, other factors of why people use drugs can include trauma, previous traumas, abuse, neglect. I mean, all of these experiential factors also impact on the individual and how they may interact with drugs and drug use. So when you look at this figure 11.9 that I have here from an integrative model of substance abuse disorders, you can see that you have exposure to drug, there's media influences, parent drug use, peer drug use, lack of parental monitoring, social and cultural expectations for use. It leads to drug use, and drug use creates a positive reinforcement and a negative reinforcement. It influences cognitive thinking. Drug abuse leads to dependence, which creates a cycle, and there are biological influences in terms of how drugs are metabolized, base levels in terms of people and how they are sensitive to drugs. So you can see here this sort of integrative model. In terms of the biological treatment of substance-related disorders, we use agonist substitution, a safe drug with a similar chemical composition as the abused drug. So this is a harm reduction process. So examples may include methadone for heroin and other drugs, or a nicotine gum or a patch to substitute nicotine. So using a less harmful mode of delivery, or a reduction of harm, but still using an agonist substitution, and then of course would be to reduce that slowly to a period of time when that is no longer required. An antagonist treatment is drugs that block the or counteract with the positive effect of the substance. So for example, naloxone for opiate or alcohol problems. Biological treatment of substance-related disorders. There are certainly other ways that treatment can occur. There's adverse treatment, so drugs that make the injection of abuse substances extremely unpleasant, and examples include an antabuse for alcoholism and a silver nitrate for nicotine addiction. And these would make somebody feel so ill and not well that they wouldn't take those medications or wouldn't take those drugs. The efficacy in biological treatment are generally not effective when used alone, so although they might be effective immediately, they don't produce long-term effects. The psychosocial treatment of substance-related problems include whether a controlled substance should be controlled or a complete abstinence is a treatment goal, and there's a variety of spectrum of treatment for a variety of users, and of course somebody who had a very mild addiction to a particular drug would not be considered an inpatient treatment or considered to be part of a harm reduction strategy that include methadone if their addiction wasn't to a drug like heroin. Data suggests there's little difference in terms of overall effectiveness in terms of whether we treat people with drug addictions in or out of patient. Community support programs are very important. Treatment is important, and what's important is to match the kind of treatment the individual that has the addiction or drug problem has, and so some people do well with Alcoholic Anonymous programs or related groups, and they seem helpful and are strongly encouraged. The other components of a comprehensive treatment and prevention program include individual and group therapy, aversion therapy, and convert sensitization, contingency management, rewarding one's individual for not taking a substance, community reinforcement, being connected to others, and having a process of relapse prevention, so that if somebody had the strategies to prevent a relapse, and lots of preventative efforts via education. So using a combination of these is probably the best combination for treatment of individuals who have substance-related disorders. The DSM-5 recognizes substance-related disorders resulting from the use of 10 separate classes of drugs that I've described here in this workshop. There are major groupings of psychoactive substances have been identified and form the basis of substance-related or addictive disorders. Of course, we talked about the pleasure pathways of the brain, and the pharmacological mechanisms of these are different, but the activation of the reward system is really what is similar across all substances, producing a pleasurable feeling, euphoria, which is often referred to as what we call the high. Psychosocial factors interact with biological influences to produce substance disorders. Treatment of substance disorders is usually unsuccessful. A highly motivated person do best when they combine treatments that I described, but of course substance-related disorders are 100% preventable. The DSM-5 recognizes that people are not all automatically or equally vulnerable to developing substance-related disorders. Some people have lower levels of self-control that predispose them to develop problems if they're not exposed to drugs. There are two groups of substance-related disorders: substance use disorders and substance-induced disorders. Substance use disorders are patterns of symptoms resulting from use of substance that you can continue to take despite experiencing problems that result. And substance-induced disorders include intoxication, withdrawal, and other substance medication-induced mental disorders that are detailed alongside substance use disorders. The criteria for substance use disorders are delivered right here for you. I specifically suggest that you pause, take some time to review the 11 different criteria that are present here, and then to continue on when you have had a chance to review this. The DSM-5 allows clinicians to specify how severe or how much of a problem the substance use disorder is, depending on how many symptoms that were identified. 2 or 3 of the symptoms indicate a mild substance use disorder, and 4 or 5 symptoms indicate a moderate substance use disorder, and 6 or more symptoms disorder indicate a severe substance use disorder. And that is the end of our lesson on substance use and abuse. And I suggest that you take some time to look at the DSM-5, look at substance use disorders, familiarize yourself with the content in the DSM-5, and connect that with this content and the other resources that I've posted on our online lesson for this week.